So it's after lunch. How's everybody's lunch? Good?
Yes, good.
I mean, the food here is always spectacular, so let's get started. You are in Leadership and the Power of Regret. Thank you for coming to my talk, especially against some of the other heavy hitters in this slot. So, as for me, that's me. Hi, I'm Arthur, or Art. Take your pick. I am an engineer. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a neurologist. I am a software engineer, like a lot of you. But I love brains. I love talking about brains, and I especially love taking what I learn and bringing it to all of you to help you be better engineers, better coworkers, and hopefully better people. I work for this company that you've never heard of. It is a tiny consultancy in Omaha, Nebraska, which is where I come from. And they let me come do cool talks like this in cool places like London, so they get a slide in the talk. Let's start off with a story of regret. This was about 2012, 2013, and I took a job with a company in America, in Omaha, that makes election machines and election software. So this was before all of that got really fraught, but I'm a political junkie. And I care a lot about the process. I care a lot about systems, about, especially systems of power. And I thought this was going to be a cool job, and it was not a cool job. I worked on the electronic poll book team, and we released too frequently for the customer service people. We released quarterly, which was unthinkable that we would do such a thing. And so they refused to support our products at all, which meant that every one of our clients had our BA's number on speed dial. And if she got a message, she was suddenly instantly at our desks, like breathing down our necks about when we were gonna get this thing fixed, and agile be damned, basically, just get it done. It was a year into that job and I was on the phone with somebody from the Hamilton County, Ohio election board. And in the United States, the average age of somebody that works on an election board is about 80. So I am on the phone attempting to explain to this gentleman how to copy paste. No, you have to click the mouse, click, and then don't let it go. Click and then drag. No, drag, move, click and then drag the mouse, and then it is about 5:30, and I've been there since about 7. And it is fair to say that in that moment, I am having a lot of regrets. And of course, I haven't worked in that job in well over a decade. And every so often, my brain will helpfully remind me about that moment as though it's, trying to be helpful, especially when I'm trying to fall asleep. That time is great. Why is any of that happening? Why is your brain doing this to you? Why is it doing that to me? Regrets can suck. They can be a powerful emotional trip up right when we least need it. And if you're leading a team, regrets can be even more powerful. Enough that the fear of regrets can actually change your behavior. It means that you can spend ages making complicated plans about how you're going to actually release and manage your software, or following incredibly baroque software development methodologies, or even just paralyzed, stuck, unable to make a decision, completely unable to decide how you're going to move forward. But regrets aren't just your brain's way of punching itself in the face, even though it feels like it. Regrets are a major way that your brain tries to turn experiences into learning, into changed behavior, and avoiding future pain. So what is regret? How can we use that more effectively? How do you take a terrible moment in your life and turn it into something that fuels you? Well, congratulations, you're sitting in the right talk for that. Today, we're going to talk about the value of regrets, and then we're going to talk about counterfactuals and what those are. We're going to talk about how to deal with emotions of regret and about using regret intelligently. Then we're going to talk about regretting the undone. And lastly, we're going to talk about communicating your regrets and how to speak about them. So let's start with the value of regret. To talk about the value of regret, we have to talk about what regret is. Now, psychologically, regret is defined as a negative emotion predicated on an upward, self-focused counterfactual. Yep, that's a bunch of words. Your brain is using regret as a way to get you to change your future behavior. That is the primary value of regret. We'll talk a lot more about that later, about how it is a fuel for you. But you did a thing, and your brain didn't like it, and it's trying to get you to not do that again. Other animals can actually experience regret as well. It's not just humans. But as far as we know, humans are the only animal that can turn around and regret a past far in the past, or envision a future that hasn't even yet happened. For better or worse, that's one of the things that has made us the dominant species on this planet. Regret operates mostly in terms of these things called counterfactuals, which is a fantastically complicated term. What a counterfactual is you imagine something going differently than it did. That's all a counterfactual is. It is counter to the facts. They come in two different types, okay? There is an upward counterfactual. And an upward counterfactual is a counterfactual in which you envision things going in a way that was more positive than it did. So you may have had a negative outcome and you're envisioning it happening in a more positive manner. So for example, the current project I'm on is back-of-house restaurant management software. And we have a need to limit what users can see reports. So if you're operating at a particular store level, because the software is mostly for franchises, this particular store, this location of an Arby's or whatever, happens to use this software, and this manager needs to see just their store. But this person who's working for them, the franchisor, needs to see all of the stores in this region, and we need to figure out a way to gate access to the reports based on that. So we invented this thing called report groups, and it doesn't matter what it did, but the point is, it busted our sprint. Figuring out, because the UX for it was this complicated drag and drop of arbitrary nested hierarchies. It needed to be that way, but the implementation of it was a thing that hadn't been quite thought through well enough. And so it blew through our sprint. We spent most of the sprint on it, most of the next sprint on it, and spent 2 entire retrospectives basically talking about, well, what went wrong. When we're sitting around thinking about how things could have gone better, how we could have done things differently in a way that would have prevented that from happening, that is an upward counterfactual. The other kind of upward counterfactuals tell us where we screwed up and how we could do better next time. The other kind is a downward counterfactual. And a downward counterfactual is envisioning things having gone worse than they actually did. So, same project. One of the first things on this project was assigned to upgrade our ESLint and standardize it between all of the projects, which should send a shiver down everybody's spine. It's like, oh God. This actually went really well. I not only standardized it on the one project I was supposed to, but standardized like all the rest of the projects in basically 2 days, which is really frightening to think about, but we got it done. I got it done, and that could have gone way worse. In fact, we were prepared for it to have gone way worse. That is a downward counterfactual, right? When you sit and think about like, oh, that could have happened and it would have been bad, but that actually went okay. A downward counterfactual is useful for making us feel better about the way things actually went. So in most cases of life, we have a situation where it's kind of in the middle, right? Some things could have gone better, some things could have gone worse. A downward counterfactual helps us feel better about how things actually went. We seem to reach for upward counterfactuals more readily. It's just something weird about us as a species, possibly because we can more directly link our behavior to them, and because they help us change future behavior. A good example of counterfactuals and kind of the differences between them actually is the Olympics. There was a psychologist, Tom Gilovich, who took photos of Olympic medalists on the medal stand at the 1992 Summer Olympics, and then went back to his lab and analyzed them. And what he found was that bronze medalists actually looked really happy because they had a downward counterfactual that they could point to, right? They got a medal. They could have not gotten a medal at all, but at least they got a medal. At least they're standing on the stand. The counterpoint to this was actually the silver medalists, who looked profoundly unhappy most of the time because they're engaging in an upward counterfactual. They could have gotten gold if only they'd shaved another millisecond off of their time. I mean, especially in the modern Olympics, right? Like, we're talking fractions of a second, fractions of a second. If you just been a little bit faster, a little more off the line, used a different shoe, a different technique, a little bit better, breathed a little more, you could have had gold. But instead you got silver. Good luck. These are the difference between these two counterfactuals. And it can be a little twisted, but I tend to think about it in terms of an upward counterfactual is there to lift you up to be better. And a downward counterfactual is a way that helps you drop the effects of regret. Once we understand the difference between those, we can make sense of this. Gilovich actually ran another study, or excuse me, Medvec ran another study where they assigned a test to a bunch of students, had them take a test, and then basically regardless of how they actually did, told them that they had either achieved or not achieved a kind of arbitrary boundary of pass-fail, and then asked them how they felt about that. Interestingly enough, the people who succeeded, who just barely succeeded, felt worse about it than the people who did not, who were really close to that line. Because it's easy to say, when you have a better boundary, to say, oh, I could have been a bit better, I just almost didn't make it, versus, oh, I just barely achieved the thing, but at least I got it. And this choice is largely unconscious. It's about what happens to us, right? We don't set the boundaries for grades. We don't set the boundaries for these things. This framing happens to us. So, if we revisit the definition of regret then, regret is when you perform an action, and then that action has a consequence, a negative consequence. It could be physical, it could be social, it could be emotional, doesn't matter. And then you can clearly link that negative situation, that outcome, to actions you either did or did not take. You can then construct an upward counterfactual about how you could have performed those other actions or not performed them. And then lastly, you have feel-bads about not doing things differently. This is regret. This process of constructing those counterfactuals and then feeling bad that the counterfactual didn't come to be. So actually, most regret happens in the moment. Because if the negative outcome is immediately obvious, you change the thing. If you look and you say, oh, this was a negative outcome and I can see the upward counterfactual that would make it so this negative outcome doesn't happen again, you just do that thing. On top of all of that, if you can change that behavior, you do it. But there is a kind of long tail of regret over time. And this happens for a couple different reasons. If the outcome of your action is not immediately, or negative outcome is not immediately obvious to you, you perform the outcome and it doesn't actually perform or appear negative to you, you don't experience regret until later when something becomes visible or evident to you. Especially when you realize that that action might imply things about you, your personality, who you are as a person, that you now don't like. But you might also be unable to construct a counterfactual because you can't see how your actions led to that negative outcome until later when you get a little more perspective about it. This is why you get those moments in bed where you're like, oh, I shouldn't have said that thing 20 years ago. When your brain is trying to help you out. So how do you deal with the emotions of regret when those things start to crop up? Well, regret is this powerful emotional and cognitive cocktail. And it can be a really overwhelming experience for us, right? Especially for things that are already emotionally charged situations. One of the most powerful of those experiences is a thing called rumination. Focusing too hard on an upward counterfactual can lead you into this trap. Now, the term rumination is actually a term for what ruminants do, where a ruminant is an animal that has a lot of stomachs, like a cow, where they proceed to eat food, vomit up their cud, chew on that for a while, swallow it back down, it goes into a different stomach. I never thought I would be drawing this for a talk, but here we are. Interesting side note, giraffes, also ruminants, didn't know that. But these animals chew their food, swallow it, vomit it back up, and chew on it again, over and over and over again. This is the process of rumination. Mental rumination is basically that, except for an experience, where you have the experience and it kind of goes away and then it comes back and you're like, oh, I'm thinking about this stuff again. And then it kind of goes away and comes back and you continually chew over it, consume it. Psychologists think that rumination, mental rumination, is actually the result of a kind of healthy experience of reflection gone somewhat haywire in your brain. Because you're not a cow, and you're not equipped to get anything out of this process. Revisiting your past is valuable. Doing it over and over and over again in ways that don't help you get anything out of it except pain is just intrusive thoughts. As an example, this is Laura Ogden and her husband Jack. Both of them were skiers. They really liked it. In fact, that's actually how they met. They really enjoyed skiing, and they really enjoyed a kind of skiing where you get in a helicopter and get taken up to the top of a mountain, they drop you off, and you ski your way down. So these are not your standard like skiing hills, et cetera. This is fresh powder. This is exciting new places and random mountains. At one point, they decided to go with a couple friends to ski on Mount Currie in Canada where they lived. And they're sitting in the helicopter, and Laura's husband, Jack, says, I'm feeling a little weird about this one. I have a bad feeling about today. Laura turns around and says, oh, come on, you're gonna have a great time. We're gonna go up to the top of the mountain, it'll be great. We'll have a blast, we'll meet at the bottom, we'll have some beers, it'll be great. It was not great. There was an avalanche. And Jack was buried in the avalanche, and they didn't make it to him in time. He suffocated. And Laura found herself trapped in a pattern of rumination. A pattern of, oh, if I'd just listened to him, if I'd only taken that moment and said, oh, it's okay, we'll cancel the trip. Now, how many times has her husband said that before? They had a bad feeling about it? How many times had she said that and nothing bad happened? Who knows? But that one moment where her brain crystallized that counterfactual led her to a bill, and because of the severity, the emotional severity of the event, it caused her to just continually come back to it over and over and over again. Ruminative regrets are actually correlated with clinical anxiety and clinical depression. And in fact, some new research indicates they might actually be predictive of those things too, which is to say, this could come before you're diagnosed with anxiety or depression. Rumination is more likely when the following things are true. First, when it's clear how your actions led to the event. It is pretty clear how Laura's situation caused the event, right? Her behavior of convincing her husband that they were still gonna go on this skiing trip led directly to her husband dying. The second point is when the negative event more immediately follows your action. The longer between your action and the outcome of that action, the more diffuse that feeling gets inside of your brain. For Laura, these two things are very immediately connected, right before they went on the trip, like literally in the helicopter to go to the top of the mountain. The consequences were severe. Now, obviously, that's true for Laura, right? And lastly, when you cannot undo the event or prevent a similar one, if you're able to turn around and cause a change that actually relieves your future pain, your brain is less likely to ruminate on it. Obviously, Laura can't go back in time. So it's kind of a perfect storm for her of all of these things being true. But what can you do about rumination? How do you get yourself out of this trap of your brain screaming at you constantly? Well, the first is actually just distract yourself. It sounds like it would be unhealthy, right? Aren't you supposed to process emotions? In this case, distraction with alternative activities like socialization, physical activity, whatever gets you out of your own head can be really helpful because you're not forcing yourself to bring those things back up again. Your brain likes to play with the thoughts that you often think about, regardless of if those are positive or negative. Therapy is actually another way to handle this. There's evidence that cognitive behavioral therapy or mindfulness or interpersonal therapy are all really good ways at dealing with rumination. But emotions can actually also be the cause of your brain generating counterfactuals. And those counterfactuals can turn into regret. So, your brain really doesn't like the idea that bad things happen with no reason. This is actually called the just world fallacy. We have a tendency to believe that the actions in the world or the actions that happen to people happen because they behaved in a certain way. And the world is just, and that good people get good things and bad people get bad things. But they don't. And that feeling of a lack of control over the world that we live in leads us to seek control elsewhere. This is called the compensatory control model. How many people remember the pandemic and the toilet paper thing, where there was no toilet paper to be found? Right. That happened partially as a result of compensatory control, because when there is a vast global pandemic and everything is on fire and you don't know how to protect you or your family, or if your job's gonna go away, or what's gonna happen to the world, it is extremely stressful. But toilet paper, you can buy the heck out of some toilet paper. Like, we're gonna do this. I'm gonna buy enough toilet paper for 20 years. We'll be settled on toilet paper. That's the compensatory control model, where you're reaching for things you can control because you don't have the ability to control everything. So, when you were grappling with a world that is, unfortunately, not just, that is random and chaotic, your brain grapples and tries to figure out what would have happened, how could the things gone differently, how does this story make any sense at all? And that can lead to your blaming yourself or other people unnecessarily. This can lead directly to victim blaming. Or, blaming yourself to believe that you did something to provoke the behavior that you feel bad about, or that caused, the negative situation, instead of believing that the person that did those actions just is operating on their own scary logic. And that the world is random and chaotic and awful, which it is. If you're trying to engage in a conscious process of looking at counterfactuals while your brain is on fire from rumination or extreme emotional responses, it's not going to be helpful. It's going to get you nowhere. You need to have a certain degree of distance from those events, whether that's time, whether that's physical, or whether that's emotional distance. Downward counterfactuals can actually help us in this regard. You can look at a situation and use a downward counterfactual to make yourself feel better about it, to get that degree of emotional distance from that upward counterfactual that lets you engage with it not profitably, better, rather. Downward counterfactuals are a buffer against that constant drumbeat of what if I had done better? So how to use upward counterfactuals intelligently once we've got that distance? Well, I've whipped together a framework for this, which unfortunately has 3 R's in it because they all do. Regret, reflect, and reform. The first step is regret, which you're probably not going to have a ton of problems following. Regrets are going to happen to you regardless. But I want you to take the time to actually experience that regret. Sit with it, feel the emotional pain of that regret. As Somerville says, regret persists in precisely those situations where the opportunity for positive action remains high. Regret tends to happen in places where you can actually change the future, where there is a possibility for you to do something different and seek a better outcome. But you also have to spend the time thinking about where you're at, where you currently are, where that's different from where you thought you would be, where that's different from where you would like to be next. All of those things help you find regrets that are actually going to be valuable. Okay, so if you've got regrets, good. The next step is reflect. Take those regrets and start thinking about them, and your brain will find an upward counterfactual more or less on its own and start screaming it at you. Which is good. Now, that's a bunch of the work done for you. But I want you to focus on that. Focus on the upward counterfactual, and then use your narrative brain. Think about what else could have happened. How would have that played out? What would have been the primary effects, the secondary effects, the tertiary effects? And then start thinking of another one. Keep writing stories. Keep hitting that next story button until suddenly you have a bunch of things, most of them probably not very likely. Once you have a list of those things, actually assess what would it take to achieve those counterfactuals? What would it take to reach those other worlds that you've just envisioned? What were the behaviors you would have had to do? What are the techniques, the steps that you would have needed to get to those places? So now you have a big list of counterfactuals and a list of behaviors. And the next step is reform. Sit down with those counterfactuals and choose which ones seem most likely to you. Okay, it might be less likely that this one thing happens or this other thing is extremely likely to happen. But you can also choose the ones with a low cost. If you look and say, well, this counterfactual isn't very likely, but the behavior I need to change to achieve that counterfactual is very small, you might just throw it on the pile. Small things like, I have a speaker bag over here as an example, with most of the cables and everything I would need. There is in this thing a VGA to HDMI adapter, which is a thing I didn't know existed until I started looking for it. Never used it, will certainly never use it anymore. But just in case, I've got it in there. Because it was $5 on Amazon, so it's, yep, click, add to bag. One less anxiety I have to worry about, basically. But I want you to look at those and evaluate them, right? Find those ones you care about and intentionally examine those and look at the counterfactuals and the behavior you need to achieve them. Once you have those things that you want to change, the counterfactuals you want to achieve, your next step is to make the change. But I want you to use your regret, to use it as fuel. Because it's your brain trying to tell you to do something differently. That pain is a fuel to you. Or it can be a fuel to you. You did that thing, it sucked. You don't want that to happen again. And so the degree of pain can actually become a thing that helps you achieve change when it's helpful. As an example, this is Dashrath Manji. He used his regret to power an amazing thing. How many people know who this is? Okay. Good, you get to hear the story for the first time. Dashrath Manji's wife, well, he lives in India. His wife died in 1959 when she fell off of a mountain path, and that same mountain ridge prevented the nearest hospital from sending an ambulance. Basically, it would take an extraordinarily long amount of time for them to get around this mountain range and actually reach her. So Dashrath turned around and said, we're going to fix that. And he hewed by hand a 110 meter long, 9.1 meter wide, and 7.7 meter deep channel through the top of the mountain ridge, literally by hand with hand tools. That shortened the distance between that side of it up there on Doler and the actual next area over here. We went from a 55-kilometer trip to a 15-kilometer trip. It took 22 years. That's a bit of an extreme example, but that's regret fueling a behavior change. Now, I'm not saying you should go out and, hew channels in mountains, unless you're into that, but I do want to contrast and compare between Laura and Dashrath. Now, I want to be real clear here. I am not at all blaming Laura for anything that's going on in her head. This is a natural, normal human reaction. But I do want to compare and contrast these two as the two kind of extremes of the human reaction to regret. Again, not blaming Laura, but it is real easy to fall prey into that path of rumination, that pattern of rumination, and to let it consume us instead of turning around and using that regret as fuel. Although I will also say, you probably should not spend 22 years doing it. He has a whole bunch of monuments. Like if you look at the map up here, they named the road after him. The mountain man is what they called him. They named Dashrath Manji. Like there's all this stuff named after him right near there. If you want that kind of fame, go to it. But I don't recommend it as a general response to, regret. But, regret does suck, and we are humans that can envision futures, so why don't we envision a future? Can we try regretting without the pain? Well, we can, because we're humans that can envision those things. But given that one of the requirements of the emotion of regret is a negative situation that provides that pain, it's going to be really hard. Your source of fuel is gone, and you have to find another one. You need to find some other thing that is going to propel you to change the behavior. If you want to do that, you can use the same framework, but instead of the regret stage where you're sitting about having the regrets that are, of the things that have already happened, picture a future after you've made a decision instead. Sit and think about, okay, what am I going to do? I'm going to try this thing. What will go wrong? What could go wrong? What are all the possible futures that could exist? A really good example of where we as humans actually do rely on this has become movies and audience review sites. Because we've actually realized that we can learn from asking people who've been in similar situations to us, right? Instead of having to just envision a future where I've seen Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, I can just go ask people and they will go like, don't see it, it's bad. Not as bad as the sequels, but you can yell at me later. Point being, we actually do rely on this. Daniel Gilbert wrote a whole book called Stumbling on Happiness that talks about how we as humans are actually really bad at knowing what's going to make us happy, and we'd have better luck if we just asked other people, what made you happy? Using this same technique can help us get to a place where we can envision a future where we didn't screw up, or where we maybe did screw up, and what could we change to not reach that future? But if we listen to those future regrets that we haven't had yet, won't we just wind up regretting everything we didn't do? Well, let's talk about that. You've probably heard some variant of this quote, 20 years from now, you will be more disappointed by the things you didn't do than by the ones you did. Supposedly said by Mark Twain, can't find a real reference for it, probably not true, doesn't matter, it illustrates the point regardless. In fact, the sheer fact that we repeat this so often, despite having no source for it at all, really just drives home the point that we are starting, especially in the modern age, to have adopted this no regrets philosophy, where we want to believe that at the end of your life, you should look back and be like, I have no regrets, including this stupid tattoo or starring in this movie. But that's not really a great way to move through life, because if you don't have any regrets, it means that you don't really have any self-examination. And it also it ignores the fact that the vast amount of your regret really takes place in the immediate moment, right? We saw that earlier. But there is this in the long tail, a kind of thing where you see over time that more of the things you regret in the long tail are undone than done. That part is true. Of the regrets that you remember, a lot more of them are undone. Why is that true? Well, it's this fun thing called the Zeigarnik effect. Anybody heard of this one? A couple people, okay. So this comes from a study in 1938 by Bloom Zeigarnik, who was a Lithuanian psychologist. And she was in Paris studying, and she noted this really annoying thing that the Parisian waiters would do at these cafes where they don't write down your order. They're like, no, I've got this. And they just, remember all of it. They don't scribble anything down. They go to the kitchen, and more annoyingly, they do actually got this. They're right. And then they come out, they remember exactly who got what. And it's like, you didn't write anything down. It didn't make me feel great about it. But they could do this. This was a skill. And so she actually developed this study, this technique, where she would interrupt them on the way to the kitchen and go like, okay, that table, what did they order? And they would nail it perfectly. And then she would ask them after the table paid and left, and they could not remember squat. As soon as that information was basically no longer what psychologists call salient in their brain dumped it. This is why when you cross something off your to-do list, remembering it is harder. Remembering the context to it is harder. When you get a ticket that finally moves into accepted, and somebody comes back like 3 weeks later or a month later and is like, hey, I have a bug in this, you're like, it might as well have been somebody else entirely who wrote that code. That's what's powering this. But it's also the fact that your brain seems to run on what's called the availability heuristic. The ease with which you recall something tends to be related to the number of instances of that thing you can remember. The more of the instances of that thing you regularly encounter, the more easy it is to bring them to mind. They're more available. And the amount of things that you didn't do is way greater than the number of things you did do. That's how human life works. Especially because we do tend to act to avoid future regrets in the moment. We often look at a situation and go, nope, that's not going to go well, so I'm going to do this thing instead. And we kind of naturally navigate through this world like that. And so we have this huge pile of things that we didn't do. And as Somerville says, remember, regret crops up when there's an opportunity for that improvement. So of course there's more regrets for stuff you didn't do, because it's easy to build a counterfactual for. You could have just done the thing. You can actually also cause yourself to regret something you otherwise wouldn't simply through the framing, though, which is a real mind twister. To talk about that, we have to talk about maximizing versus satisficing. So this comes from psychologist Barry Schwartz, where he talks about maximizing mindset, rather, being one where you are trying to maximize the utility of your choice, which is the most economics-driven sentence I've said on stage. It's it's literally this XKCD comic. It is trying to maximize, to go between these things and say, well, this, how many people have bought like a router or a TV in the last 5 years? It's nonsense. The list of features between them, well, this one has like dual Doppler scaling and like OLED, and like, I don't even know what half these words mean, but this one doesn't have it. And that's important to me now for some reason. This is a maximizing mindset. You're doing research, you're trying to get more information, which is actually a cognitive bias that your brain thinks more information is good and leads to better decisions, which it doesn't. That's a different talk. But point being, you can get trapped in this mindset. The counterpoint to this mindset is what Schwartz called satisficing. How many people remember seeing this go around? It goes in the square hole. Yeah. No offense to this TikTok user, tired actor, but that is satisficing. Like, does it work? Sure does. Goes in the square hole, fine. A satisficing mindset is actually a portmanteau of the two words satisfies and suffices. You're looking for something that satisfies your criteria and suffices for the task. Somerville herself actually talks about this with her wedding dress, where she used her knowledge of psychology to turn around, and it's real tempting in like you're looking for a wedding dress, looking for something very important, to do that kind of maximizing mindset, to go look for those things, and to go seek out the absolute best thing. But the problem is that there are a lot of things anymore. There are too many dang choices, like usual, and when we attempt to apply a maximizing mindset to all of that, our brain doesn't take it well, because we start obsessing over those attributes that don't matter. Somerville then actually used this to turn around and go, nope, I'm going to pick like the third dress that I encountered. Not up front, but she was trying them on. She found one that fit, it looked good, and she said, you know what, this is the one. Because it actually satisfied her criteria, and it sufficed for the task. It was a dress, and it made her look good, and it met what she needed price-wise. Done, check. And the reason is because if you don't, you spend a lot of time in pain, in regret. More information on a task means you can more easily construct a counterfactual and experience that regret about those things, because you spend time on it and then you become emotionally convinced you could have done better. Like, I did find the best thing, I think. It certainly works for everything I need, but maybe it could have been red. That would have been important, right? If you could differentiate between when maximizing matters and when it doesn't, you can avoid a lot of regret. So I like looking for satisficing in the world, actually, as a hobby. This one's one of my new favorites. This is a soap dispenser that happens to just like drop a couple drops off the bottom when you're done, or to accidentally activate sometimes. So instead of like replacing all of these in the facility they were in, they just put a little cup under each one. Done. This one was from, actually, I took this at a client site that I was at, where they built this expensive new building that did not have like awnings over the doors for some insane reason. So what they did was actually, so then when it rained, this entire area would just become sodden, like absolutely soaking wet, both from the blow-in from the door and people's shoes. They literally just had a blower next to each one that they would plug in when it rained to help dry the thing out. This is the most recent one I've taken. This was in an airport bus, one of the buses that'll take you like from the terminal to the plane for the cases where it's actually got a ramp up to the plane. You can see, like, it's not in use, but you can see the icons on the left. Like, this is not a program that they have running that tells you it's not in use. They just changed the background like the desktop background, to say, oh, when the program crashes, the desktop will tell them that it's not in use. Which is like, you look at that and you're like, surely there could have been a better way. Yeah, there probably could have been, but this works. That's the heart of satisficing. And when we maximize too much, we turn into just piles of goo, unable to make the smallest decisions, and then we inevitably regret the ones that we do take. But on the other hand, when we satisfice too much, we don't find the best solution when it really matters to us. Schwartz himself says, as a general rule, maximizers do better but feel worse. So, we've talked a lot about regret. Let's talk about regret when we have multiple people involved. This surely won't be complicated. Remember, regret is a self-focused emotion. That's part of the definition. It's about the behaviors and the actions that you took and the outcomes that happened to you. Because, I mean, let's be frank, your brain mostly cares about you. That's not an individual condition. That is largely the human condition. But there's actually this weird, relatively recent line of research that theorizes that we actually join groups in order to help diffuse regret. When it's our choice to join a group, sometimes we do it because it will help us experience less regret. The quote from the actual study is, decision makers therefore seek to protect themselves from possible future blame for difficult, uncertain decisions. We're emotionally self-protecting ourselves sometimes by joining a group. In this particular one, it was the study was about a leadership group that people were joining to help them get basically the same feedback on like, oh no, you did the right thing. Like that had a negative outcome, but you did the right thing. If we get buy-in from others on our actions, then the actual responsibility and thus the blame and the regret is shared. It becomes distributed, our actions become diffused, and it's harder to tie regret to a single individual. And that makes it harder to construct a counterfactual because, well, this is the thing the team did, so surely I couldn't have affected that at all. What you need to do if you're working with a team or leading a team is you need to establish what's called identifiability, the ability to trace people's actions forward through the team to outputs. But you need to do that while not really sacrificing the independence that makes a team an actual team. Because that is one of the attributes of a team versus, say, a work group, is they are dependent, interdependent on each other. Now, what that actually does suggest is that if you have a team with more self-autonomy and more self-governance, they will actually experience regret more equally because they have fewer people to push that blame onto. Fewer people that they look at and say, well, okay, I couldn't have never have done that because this team lead wouldn't let me do it. I could have never done that because this manager wouldn't let me do it. The more egalitarian you can make those teams, the more they'll naturally feel regret and thus be more likely to actually push for improvement. That also means that you shouldn't shield your team entirely from the negative consequences of their actions. This is a thing I have seen over the last probably 10 years, is this increased tendency for managers or leads or anybody in a leadership role to try and shield their team from the chaos that's happening in their organization. And don't tell me your team or your organization doesn't have chaos, because I won't believe you. But they try to protect their entire team, and sometimes they're protecting the team from the consequences of their actions. So take, for instance, you have a junior that drops a database on prod. Okay, that's a thing that happens, right? I'm not advocating that you should fire that person. But I am advocating that when you have the all-hands call and the crash team and the response, et cetera, that person should be in the room. If you're up at 2 in the morning restoring client databases, that person should be in the room. You have to make it hurt for them to help them have regrets. You don't want that to be disproportionate, but it does need to be there. What about retrospectives and postmortems? Can we talk about regrets there? Well, first we have to distinguish between what the difference between those two is, because a lot of people get them twisted. So to me, a retrospective is looking back over a sprint or some other development interval. We have had a regular cadence of things happen, and we are now looking back at those things. This differs from a postmortem, which to me is analyzing a severe failure or some kind of catastrophic incident. This distinguishes these two meetings, which sometimes we call the same thing. Now, in a retrospective, regrets are okay, but they are unlikely to surface. We're likely not going to get people willing to talk about the regrets they had in a retrospective. Because largely, our retrospectives have become places that emotions really aren't acceptable, which is problematic in a bunch of other ways. But in this particular case, in a natural, normal cadence, we're not likely to get people talking about what could have gone better or what the regrets were. In a postmortem, you want to tamp them down. You do not want regrets in those moments, because it's too easy to go from regret to blame. And a postmortem is especially not a place for blame, not of an individual. Now, you can't keep a postmortem completely emotionless. In fact, not only can't you, you shouldn't, but you want to offer some structured time for those emotions, and instead of allowing them to run the entire postmortem for you. Instead, the place where you should really, or where you can get the most bang for your buck on regrets is when you're planning, when you're architecting. Those are the moments when you should sit back and say, how are we going to solve this? That's similar to this other thing. I have a regret about that. Maybe we should do something different. Those are the moments when you should explicitly be seeking out people's regrets, because they're going to give you the most, like this is the moment when you can change them most easily, right? Before you committed to it, not after. But we want to learn more from just the mistakes our team makes individually, or once the team forms. We want to leverage the experience our teams have gotten from elsewhere, because they've been somewhere else, probably, a different team, maybe at the same company, maybe different companies. But to do that, we have to make use of the other human skill that benefits us a lot, which is communication. So how do we talk about regrets to other people? Well, regret is typically about negative emotion due to a personal decision, right? This means that it is locked inside of our heads and that we need to let it out. But it becomes really difficult to translate. But it's even more important, because if it's locked in everybody's heads, then we have to communicate about it. That's the only way to get it out. We have to make our teams understand that the action, either the one we took or the one we're thinking about taking, has consequences, has had a negative effect in the past, at least to somebody. But when we're sitting down talking about these things, if we're trying to make someone regret an action that they don't perceive as incorrect, or that they didn't actually suffer a negative consequence from, it's a lot like trying to explain a dream you had to someone. It goes on forever and they don't care. You need to make it hurt. And I'm not saying physically, or even really emotionally. The way to make your coworkers care about regrets is to become a better storyteller. Simply stating the facts isn't effective. You need to turn around and make them understand the pain. Because saying, we're considering making this choice, I did it once, I regretted it, is going to get you this response. It doesn't convey that pain effectively. It doesn't convey the story effectively. You need to convey that emotion to them, to build it into the story you're telling. And I know, emotions at work. But simply relating the facts isn't going to change their mind. You need to tell them a story that conveys the expression that you went through, that conveys the pain that you endured as a result of that action, that talks about your journey through that process. These need to be war stories, which is a technique that largely we've kind of abandoned as an industry. Because, it was one event. This isn't, it's not repeatable. We don't have data about it. We do. We have a bunch of people who did the thing and they said it sucked. Like, we can't and should not discount those. If you can effectively share regret, you can actually invoke that feeling in others. Humans have what are these things called mirror neurons up in our prefrontal cortex, that when we see somebody exhibiting an emotion, we tend to unconsciously kind of mirror that emotion. And they work in a whole bunch of different ways, actually. If you're having a really fun conversation with somebody, I recommend just like folding your arms and seeing if they unconsciously fold their arms too. That'll actually, if they do that, you are in sync at that moment. Like their mirror neurons are firing, thinking about you and vice versa. So when do we want regret? And when is it just going to be painful and useless? We've been dancing around this question the entire talk. And the major answer here is it's all about control. If you actually have control, instead of just feeling like you have control, and there is a difference, then regret can be helpful. Otherwise, it's just pain for pain's sake. This means that regretting something that your team did as though it was your personal action is not necessarily good. This is part of why we seek that group formation, because it allows us to diffuse that blame, to diffuse those emotions across multiple people. So, for example, let's talk about control. When I was writing this talk and drawing the slides for it, my mom somehow contracted necrotizing fasciitis, which I won't get into the details. Please don't Google image search it. Don't. But it is what's commonly called flesh-eating bacteria. And my first response to my dad was literally, no, she doesn't. Because he called me on the phone and like told me he was eating breakfast. I'm like, no, she doesn't. That's a House episode. That doesn't happen to real people. It does. She got it in her hand. She has kept the hand. She's got full mobility back, so like you can take a breath now. None of that was a guarantee up front. Like her keeping the hand, not necessarily likely in that moment. She had a really good medical team. She got access to care when she needed it. It was, especially in the US, lucky. But I found myself in my mom's hospital room drawing slides for this talk. And there's a natural question there of, did I regret signing up for the conference that I had to give this talk for? And the answer to the question is honestly no. Because in that moment, I could have never known that my mom was going to get necrotizing fasciitis. When I signed up, when I submitted to the CFP, to the conference to give the talk, when I thought about the talk and said, this would be cool, it'll be a great idea, and it'll be a good talk, I had no idea that this was going to happen. I could not have had any idea. I mean, if I did, I really should have, done something to stop it. So regret isn't helpful in that moment because it doesn't give me anything. There is no counterfactual for me to build, right? My actions are completely unconnected with the outcomes. Aside from that, I was in my mom's hospital room, like trying to manage with her doctors and also furiously drawing slides. When it comes to your teams, you want to encourage a gentle regret. Okay? You want to give them enough emotion to work with, but not enough to overwhelm them with rumination or useless counterfactuals. You're trying to find that balance of those moments when they have the control for the thing, which does mean giving them some degree of control over those things. Going back to that question about autonomy. Okay, let's review. Regret is your brain using counterfactuals and emotion to get you to improve your future behavior. You use upward counterfactuals for learning and downward counterfactuals for feeling better about how things went. Rumination can lock you into cycles of just useless regret and emotional distress. You don't tend to regret the undone more than the done, but you remember it longer because of the Zeigarnik effect. And there's that framework, the regret, reflect, reform framework that can help you make use of upward counterfactuals more effectively. So, let's talk a little bit about what you can do as a manager and a leader, what you could do at work on Monday. Well, you can engage in regret sharing with your team. Learn to tell that story and tell your team about the experiences that you've gone through. If you can help model that behavior to your team, it will help them pick it up, help them become better at sharing regrets with each other, which is really what you want. It's not just about your regrets, it's everybody's regrets. You want to try to make that work identifiable and allow actual autonomy in the teams because that's going to lead to more natural regret occurring in those individuals. And you want to try to raise the stakes a little bit by letting consequences, appropriate consequences, accrue to the team members themselves. If you're not a manager, you're not a leader, you're just somebody working on the code, there's still some stuff you can do. First, know when you should be maximizing and when you should be satisficing. This framework can help you make good choices, especially when it comes down to what should we write this application in? What framework should we use? What front-end framework? Pick your particular poison of JavaScript, right? That can help you make that decision, because instead of going through and going, well, this one has this and this one has that, make a list of criteria, go out and find the first thing, maybe the second thing that satisfies those criteria and suffices for the task. Satisficing. You want to try to think forward to see what you will regret. Use that framework of looking forward into a future that hasn't happened yet, instead of thinking backward to the things you do regret. That can help you as an individual make better decisions. Regret is an extremely powerful emotion that can really catapult us and our team's performance if we're doing it right, or it can keep us trapped in the past if we're not. If you have a knowledge of your own regrets and understand what they are, and you're able to share those regrets effectively with your teams, you can unlock some real magic. And that can take all of you together into a better place. So, thank you very much for listening. If you're interested, the slides are here, or that QR code. If you've got any questions, I will be up here, or you can catch me. Basically, I'll be here today and Thursday, and I have to leave early Friday morning. But you can catch me at the attendee party, or if you're going to the dinner tonight, I'll be there. So thank you very much for listening.